Revolution, 1979 to 1987. To tell the truth, I had no interest in politics in the 1970s or much of the 1980s. From the time I had left university in 1975 until 1983, I had been so single-mindedly and obsessively involved in international cricket that I had no time to think about much else. Anyone who has played professional sport would understand how it completely takes over one's life. One lives and breathes the sport. So intense is the competition and hence the focus. Over the years, I came to the conclusion that genius is being obsessed with what you are doing. So I was too absorbed to worry about the consequences of Zia's military regime, his slow reversal of Bhutto's nationalization program, or the turmoil in neighboring Iran and Afghanistan. Life continued as normal for most people. The only ones who really felt Zia's rule were his opponents. As the captain of the Pakistan cricket team, I had a good relationship with Zia. He used to call me personally when we won matches, and when, in 1987, he asked me on live television to come back out of retirement for the sake of the country. I agreed. Only after his regime ended did I realize his devastating legacy, and that, like so many of Pakistan's leaders, he was motivated purely by his desire to stay in power and was oblivious to the country's decline, or the long-term consequences of his policies. Amidst the steady erosion of the country's political and social fabric, the Pakistani people drew solace from its success in cricket. During the 1970s and 1980s, our team started growing in strength to the point that we could match our former colonial masters. For teams like Pakistan, India and the West Indies, a battle to right colonial wrongs and assert our equality was played out on the cricket field every time we took on England. My friends, and two of my greatest opponents on the cricket field, Sir Vivian Richards from the West Indies and Sunil Gavaskar from India, were both examples of sportsmen who wanted to assert their equality on the cricket field against their former colonial masters. I know that the motivation of the great teams produced by the West Indies in the 1970s and 1980s was to beat the English. For Viv in particular, it was about self-esteem and self-respect. The two things that colonialism deprives the colonized of. Sport was not the only way to demonstrate post-colonial independence. I little realized how far the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 would transform the Muslim world. However, it was a watershed moment in the way the West would view the Muslim world. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan later that year, putting Pakistan in the front line of the Cold War, few of us fully grasped the extent to which that too would affect Muslim thinking in the world in general and Pakistan in particular. I had visited Iran in 1974 when I went to stay with a school friend from my time at the Royal Grammar School, Worcester in England. Seeing the economic and cultural divide of Iranian society and women in miniskirts in the bazaars of Tehran surprised me. In today's Lahore and Karachi I have seen a similar disparity, rich women going to glitzy parties in Western clothes, chauffeured by men with entirely different customs and values. But at the time I had never seen people behave in such a westernized way in a Muslim country and was shocked by their disregard for the cultural mores of the masses. I remember the look on the faces of the stall holders in the bazaars as these women in short skirts sashayed past. The Iranian Islamic Revolution a few years later was to draw heavily on the support of the Bazaris, who formed the backbone of a traditional, devout middle class in Iran that felt threatened by the Shah's attempts to impose an alien culture upon them, and enraged by his role as a puppet of the West. In Pakistan, however, westernized people like me were, when we visited our ancestral villages or went into rural areas, or even the old city of Lahore, we had to respect local customs and sensitivities. The women in our family would wear the chador, a cloth covering the head and shoulders, leaving only the face exposed, or the burqa, a long garment covering the whole body. Even in Lahore, my mother always covered her hair when she went shopping in the bazaar. To this day most women in Pakistan wear the traditional shalwar kameez with dupatta, headscarf. Only very recently have younger urban women started to wear jeans. The Iranian Revolution was a reaction in part to rapid westernization and secularization campaigns in Iran by Reza Shah, the ruler of Iran from 1925 until he was forced to abdicate by the Allied powers in 1941, and then his son Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The latter was a brutal autocrat seen to be beholden to the United States. After he was restored to power following a 1953 CIA-backed coup to overthrow nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had the temerity to stand up for the rights of the Iranian people and seize the country's oil production, which had hitherto been controlled by the British government's Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Muhammad Reza Shah's sweeping social and economic changes alienated the poor, the religious, and the traditional merchant class, who grew resentful of an elite enriched by the 1970s oil boom. Meanwhile, there was a growing class of rural poor who had moved to the cities in the hope of benefiting from the petrodollar-fueled economic growth, but found themselves unemployed, consigned to the slums, and increasingly under pressure from inflation as the economy overheated. The revolution led by Khomeini promised to return power to the people and restore religious purity to Iran. The events of 1979 in Tehran and the establishment of an Islamic State highlighted to the world the revolutionary potential of Islam and its power to threaten the established order in the Muslim world. The overthrow of a tyrant was welcomed jubilantly by ordinary people in Islamic countries, most of whom were also suffering under the anti-democratic rule of leaders they viewed as Western stooges, disconnected from the economic realities and religious faith of their people. As with the Middle East revolts in 2011, a sense of euphoria rippled across the region. The broad base and strength of a movement that had toppled such a powerful US-backed regime was also inspiring to people long resentful of colonial interference and Western hegemony. And it had been achieved through relatively peaceful means, with mass demonstrations and strikes. In Pakistan there was tremendous excitement, and I could sense this when I returned from playing cricket in England in the summer months. Since independence we had already been governed by 4 different constitutions. We had run through parliamentary democracy, Ayub Khan's presidential democracy, which was effectively a military dictatorship, economic liberalization and martial law. Yet here was Khomeini standing up to the West with a new system that was both Islamic and anti-imperialist. The political Islam of the Iranian Revolution filled the void left by the failure of Arab nationalism in the Muslim world. Socialism had been discredited and communism had never really taken off in a culture where religious faith is such an intrinsic part of life. As the Iranian slogan went, neither East nor West, Khomeini had forged a new path that owed little to either the Western powers or communist Russia. And he explicitly presented his ideology as an exportable political solution to the entire Islamic world. Consequently, the West was terrified the Muslim world had reached a new turning point. At stake were Western puppet regimes in oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, whose royal family Khomeini openly criticized. In the same way that the West turned a blind eye to corrupt regimes that claimed to safeguard the free world from the evils of communism. From then on, autocratic rulers could manipulate Western fears in order to clamp down on any political opposition in the name of fighting Islamic fundamentalism. The 9/11 attacks on the United States further reinforced this tendency. It was also at this point that the West started sending NGOs into Muslim countries to encourage secularization, often in the name of liberating our women or promoting human rights. Whenever there is unrest in an Islamic country, the old fears about Iranization or Islamization of the country in question are raised by the West. Only recently, in early 2011, this happened when the people of Egypt and Tunisia toppled their dictators. Other countries, too, faced internal dissent but dealt harshly with it. However, in Yemen and Bahrain, the actions that in Libya would lead to NATO intervention were allowed to continue as the regimes were deemed pro-Western. Zia, keen to legitimize his unconstitutional takeover of Pakistan, felt the mood created by the Iranian Revolution and responded accordingly. His predecessor, the Oxford and Berkeley-educated Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had used religion to counter his Western secular image by pandering to the religious parties. Bhutto's 1973 constitution confirmed Pakistan's identity as an Islamic republic. The teaching of Islam was made compulsory in schools and a council of Islamic ideology was set up to advise on Islamic legislation. He had declared the Ahmadi sect non-Muslims. His critics, though, only hardened their demands, campaigning for the introduction of more Islamic laws. Zia cashed in on the opposition to Bhutto from the religious parties, which equated secularism with anti-Islamism. He was prepared to go much further than Bhutto, pledging on coming to power in 1977 to make Pakistan an Islamic state. His version of the Nizam-e-Mustafa, the system of the Prophet, aimed to overhaul penal codes inherited from the British by bringing them into line with Sharia law. Emboldened by events in Iran, from 1979 he introduced still more reforms, Islamizing the economy and education system. He tried to introduce interest-free banking, imposed the automatic deduction of zakat, a proportion of one's wealth which every Muslim has to contribute annually, from bank accounts and invested in madrasas. The Hudud Ordinance imposed strict punishments for crimes, including adultery and its abuse by a corrupt police and judicial system undermined the legal status of women, especially in the lower strata of society. Zia revamped so many laws, but failed to introduce true Islamic social justice. In fact, his regime actually promoted inequality and corruption. His political use of Islam was aimed more at capturing the mood of the time. Zia also enforced Islamic rituals and promoted traditional dress codes in a bid to Islamize the country. Many years later Musharraf attempted to overhaul Pakistan and turn it into a modern, liberal secular state by encouraging the use of English and Western dress, which he thought would westernize Pakistan. Zia's Islamization and Musharraf's enlightened moderation failed in their aims, as in such situations people follow the latest diktats, but inwardly carry on as before. Both Zia and Musharraf failed to understand that imposing outward observances will neither instill a sense of religious faith nor propel a country into the 21st century. General Zia's Islamization program received another boost with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Practically overnight he became a key Cold War ally of the Americans, who now forgot their qualms about backing a military dictator. Perhaps this was the origin of the saying that you need the support of the 3S to lead Pakistan: Allah, the Army, and America. It was another example of the US's ability to pick and choose when to object to evil despots, or not, while lecturing the developing world on The universal importance of democracy and human rights. Fearful that the Soviets might push through Afghanistan to reach the Arabian Sea in the Gulf and choke off vital oil supplies, the CIA, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states, through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the LSI, funded, trained, and armed thousands of militants to fight them. Many of these jihadis stayed on in Pakistan after the war, unwanted by their own governments. Having created these foot soldiers to do jihad against communism, the United States and its allies hunted them down as Al-Qaeda members and jihadis a decade after the Soviet withdrawal. At the time, there was a general feeling in Pakistan that the war against the Soviet occupiers was a just war and people made tremendous sacrifices. With my journalist friend Harun Rashid, I met so many young men in Peshawar who had done time in Afghanistan, guerrillas they might be called now. But they were heroes fighting against occupation. A romantic cause that drew idealists from across the Muslim world in the way the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War had attracted thousands of non-Spanish volunteers in the 1930s. They became rapidly disillusioned with the way the groups changed at the end of the war. However, unlike Musharraf after 9/11, Zia never allowed the CIA to spread its network within Pakistan. It was the LSI who trained the militant groups funded by the CIA. Jihad is a vital concept in Islam, indeed it is the most important concept in terms of an Islamic society. Jihad is about standing up to injustice, and it keeps a society alive and vibrant. In Islam, there are three types of jihad. The first is the individual struggle to purify one's soul of evil influences. The second is to strive for justice through nonviolent means, and the third is the use of physical force in defense of Muslims against oppression or foreign occupation. A Muslim must stand up for justice for any human being's rights, regardless of their religion. When a society does not stand for justice, it dies. 2 million people marched against the Iraq War because they felt it was unjust. Were they Muslims, they would have called this protest jihad. After all, the Quran repeatedly points out that God loves not aggressors. And if everyone in a society stands up for justice, then their rulers have to listen. In the 1980s, the concept of jihad became glamorous because of the fight against the Soviets. Now it is a word associated with terrorism. There remains nothing wrong with the concept of jihad, a struggle for doing the good and forbidding the evil, but like all noble concepts, it can be misused. For many men drawn to Afghanistan, this was a clear-cut case of helping the Afghans fighting for an occupation. The tribal areas on the border with Afghanistan faced for the first time in their history an influx of foreign fighters gathered from the Muslim world to fight the Russians. Thousands of Saudis, Yemenis, Egyptians, Algerians, Tunisians and Iraqis flocked to Afghanistan, often passing through Pakistan. Trained by the LSI and funded by the CIA. A Saudi billionaire who had sacrificed a life of luxury to fight for the Afghan people was one who drew particular admiration. He was Osama bin Laden. My friend the lawyer Akram Sheikh remembers seeing him at a reception at the American Embassy in Islamabad in 1987. I went to a fundraising ball for the Mujahideen in 1983 at the Café Royal, a bastion of London's wealthy elite once frequented by Winston Churchill and Oscar Wilde. It was a very fashionable cause to support, with campaigners in the UK including Lord Cranborne, an old Etonian Conservative MP, and in the United States, Joanne Herring, the Texan socialite portrayed in the book and film Charlie Wilson's War. The Legendary Pushtun pride, courage and lack of self-pity inspired their backers. In 1985, Ronald Reagan famously introduced members of the Mujahideen as the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers during their visit to the White House. Amongst them was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of the Hezb-e Islami political party and paramilitary group, a key figure in the Afghan jihad against the Soviets and the main recipient of foreign funding for the cause. He is now waging a jihad against NATO forces in Afghanistan, who as far as he is concerned are foreign occupiers just as the Russians were. He is now wanted by the United States for participating in terrorism with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and termed by the State Department a specially designated global terrorist.